the biographical works on the life of Jesus Christ as available in the Bible are historical indeed. But do they communicate to us that Jesus is God? Hello and welcome. This is Arun Velusamy and you're watching the fourth session of the four-part series called The Historical Jesus as God. This series is a live webinar series and has been prepared with people who do not know much about the Bible or about Jesus Christ in mind. And therefore, please feel free to ask any question that you may have about the content which is shared with you today. You must find details of how to ask these questions on your screen right now. You can either text on the live chat available on YouTube, or you can text your question to the mobile number shown on the screen. No question is a simple question, and therefore please feel free to ask any question that you may have in your mind. You can send a question at any point in time during the session today, but the questions would be answered at the end of the session. Hopefully we should have at least 10 minutes or so for question and answer at the end. In the first session of our four-part webinar series, we saw that the biographical works on the life of Jesus Christ, namely the books called the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, which are found in the Bible, are indeed first century documents. In our second session, we established that the context used in those documents are historical in nature. This we saw by looking at various people, information related to finance, geography, politics, and so on in the narration of the life of Jesus Christ. And we compared them against various archaeological and literary evidences that we have outside of the Bible. In the third session, we established that the main narration contained in the Gospels, in the biography or biographies of the life of Jesus, in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, are found to be historical, and we established this by comparing the crux of the narrative against extra biblical sources. You may remember that we looked at sources like Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, the Babylonian Talmud, and so on. So that's what brings us to our current and final session. So far where we are is that we have found the gospel narratives to be historical in nature, and we have found that the narration is actually from the first century, which is during the time of Jesus on earth. Now we are faced with the challenge of establishing whether the beliefs that the early followers of Jesus had could be established to be rational or not. That's the challenge we face today. So the main points that we'll be looking at today are the 3 points you see on your screen right now. Firstly, we'll need to look again to see if the 4 Gospels we looked at are the only authoritative records of the life of Jesus. Secondly, we try and see the core beliefs communicated in these Gospels. And thirdly, we try and see if the core beliefs communicated are rational indeed. Now let's look at one simple thing, one specific detail from session number 3. In the third session, using sources like Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, we established that the early followers of Jesus worshiped Jesus, but more importantly, that they were persecuted right in Jerusalem and also across a wider part of the world at that time. In other words, Christians in the first century were persecuted. And we also see that despite the persecution, Christians, at least the ones that Pliny the Younger testified of, did not recant, did not give up on their beliefs, especially that of considering Jesus to be God. And the reason I'd like to reiterate those couple of points right now is because that's the basis of the remaining part of our current session. That's one of the fundamental points that we would use in examining critically some of the things that we would see today. In the point of being persecuted and being unwilling to give up their beliefs on the life of Jesus or about Jesus, the early Christians essentially exhibited a very firm conviction. Now, it is true that various sorts of people who follow various religions across various points in time in our history do exhibit such firm conviction. So, at a very cosmetic level, this may look very similar. So, in that cosmetic level, what is clear is that the beliefs of the Christians was based on very firm conviction, especially given the fact that, for example, Pliny the Younger records that he gave them a chance to merely give up on their beliefs. If only they gave up, they would continue to live. But the very fact of them not giving up would mean Pliny the Younger would execute them. Now, in other words, the conviction has been proven to be very, very, let's say, hard or solid. Now, that means to us that early Christians, the first century Christians, are reliable witnesses. Whatever they believed in, they could be believed at the face value of their communication. What that leaves us with is the fact that the only thing we need to verify is that some of the conclusions which they may hold might be complex conclusions. Even though we may take them, we may take the basic conclusions at the face value of the testimonies of these Christians. For the complex conclusion, we need to examine if the Christians' reasons for holding those conclusions are rock solid even today. If only we can establish that, we would be able to establish for ourselves, people in the 21st century, that Jesus Christ could be believed to be God, just like how Christians in the first century believed so. In other words, just to summarize again, the firm conviction exhibited by Christians in the first century despite persecution means they could be held as reliable witnesses, at least for the basic conclusions that those Christians had. And that only leaves us the complex conclusions that they had for us to evaluate for our sake in the 21st century. with that in mind, let us first move to finding out the sources which are the official records for Christians' beliefs, because we need to understand right now what the Christians' beliefs are, and therefore we need to find out what the official sources are for us to gather these basic Christian beliefs. So the official records, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why not anything else is what we need to initially stand up to. You may know that over the centuries, historians have figured out that there are multiple other Gospels that are available for us. You might have heard about things like Gospel of Thomas and so on, some more popular than others. There are also a few books of Acts, what are called Acts, which gives the narration of the early church's history after Jesus was believed to have ascended up into the heavens. So Gospels and a book of Acts, there are a few apart from what we find in the Bible. Of course, in the Bible we have 4 Gospels and 1 book of Acts, but there are multiple others which have surfaced over the centuries. So the challenge for us is, why do we consider only the 4 Gospels which we have in the Bible and only the 1 book of Acts which we have in the Bible? Why not anything else? There are a few different ways of approaching the subject. For example, we could examine the manuscriptal evidence and the historical backdrop for the different manuscripts of the various other Gospels that we have, and try and see if they trace their origin back to the 1st century Judea. That's one way of doing this. We could look at all sorts of details related to that to examine that. I'm going to take a simple approach and leave the more detailed analysis for another session of its own. The simple approach that I'm going to do is to refer to one of the first few historical resources that we have in our access, which actually lists the official documents which early Christians used to communicate what they observed to be the life of Jesus and the life of the early church. I don't mind reiterating something which I mentioned to you maybe a couple of times already, and that is the fact that when the Christians say this is our official stuff, I think we should be willing to take them at the face value, and that is because they had shown conviction enough, even through facing death and persecution, conviction enough for us to take their testimonies as reliable testimonies. Now, before I introduce to you the document which gives us the list of documents which need to be in the Gospels or in the Bible, I'd like to briefly look at what I call internal evidence from the Gospels that we use, the 4 Gospels that we use. Now, when I say internal evidence, what I am talking about is really the fact that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do have enough information in themselves which make them reasonable candidates for them to be considered as official records. For example, the Gospels have events which took place at specific timing, and they narrate those events mentioning those specific times in which those events happened. They have also specific people in specific who had specific issues which Jesus dealt with. The Gospels also give details about even events to an extent. They give details about specific dinner occasions in the life of Jesus. Now, beyond this, a couple of specific Gospels, Luke and John, also explicitly give some information which make us think that these four Gospels, and especially the Gospel of Luke and John, are written by people who were close to the church and close to Jesus Christ. Now, for instance, Luke, essentially in the first few verses of his Gospel, says that he was talking about things which fulfilled among Luke and his audience. And he goes on to clarify that eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered these things to them, and that Luke himself had perfect understanding of all things from the very first. So all indicating to the fact that Luke is certainly a reliable official record. Similarly, the writer of what we call the Gospel of John essentially clarifies that he was very close to Jesus, even leaning on Jesus during a specific incident we call the Last Supper. And he also clarifies that he was someone who was uniquely qualified to be uniquely identified as the disciple whom the Lord loved. And he also mentions that there are other close disciples of Jesus who were willing to vouch for the record of the writer of the Gospel of John. In other words, certainly Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are qualified enough for us to consider them to be official communication from the first century persecuted church. Now, of course, we said we're willing to take them at their face value in terms of their claims, because their claims, the conviction that they brought in could be verified through the persecution they faced and their unwillingness to give up on their beliefs. But now, just to examine the other candidates, are there other books which even would qualify to come in? So here is where, again, we are going to depend on the early church's testimony from themselves. If they say, please consider these books, that's what we would consider, because the persecuted church gave clear communication about what they considered to be official record. For instance, early church leaders recognized in the mainstream church, like Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement, Tertullian, quote specifically from the four Gospels that we have in our hands: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. The quotations they have in various literature that they have produced are distinctly from these four Gospels. So that's an implicit communication to us that it is these four Gospels which are the official records. An explicit communication about this is a 2nd century document, archaeological artifact that we have in our hands today, which we call the Muratorian Canon. The Muratorian Canon essentially lists all the books that the early Christians considered to be official. Now, this specific list essentially has 4 Gospels and 4 Gospels alone, and only 1 book of Acts. These are the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and the Acts of the Apostles that we have in our Bibles today. In other words, the explicit communication and the implicit communication from the early Christians is that the Gospels that we have in our access today as part of the Bible are the only official records that we need to consider as when we consider the accounts or witness statements of the first century church. Now, before I move on to listing out some specific details about the beliefs that the early church had, what I call the official beliefs, before I move on to that, I'd like to just introduce to you three categories of the early disciples that I have come up with. And these categories are extremely important for us to discuss some details about the core beliefs that we'll be looking at. So in that context, can I please introduce to you the categories: thorough eyewitnesses, inner circle of disciples, and other disciples. This is important because when we looked at the core beliefs of the early church, what we would find is in most cases the beliefs would be because of witnessing by thorough eyewitnesses and many others in public, and in select few cases we'd also be talking about eyewitness accounts from the inner circle. Now, what do I mean by thorough eyewitnesses? Now, Jesus chose some people to follow him day in, day out. These people he called apostles, which in other words means official emissaries. Now, these people were selected with a specific intent, and that was that they might be with Jesus. So these people Jesus essentially took with him wherever he went. From the gospel accounts and from the Acts of the Apostles, what we also find is that the people who followed with Jesus through most of his public ministry life are not only the apostles whom Jesus had intended to use as official emissaries, but also some others who are clarified to be people who accompanied Jesus at all times. There are also some specific 70 people who Jesus himself used after the apostles to be people who shared about Jesus Christ across Judea and Samaria. So these are the thorough eyewitnesses. We're not saying that they saw Jesus at every moment of his life in his public ministry, but what we are rather saying is that they were witnesses of all the crucial points in Jesus' public ministry. Now, a select three among the apostles are also what I am going to call inner circle, which is a term which is widely used by other people also. These are Simon Peter, James, and John. These three people had the privilege of witnessing three specific events in the life of Jesus alone. Those three are, in one specific point in time, a young girl was brought back to life after she was dead. Jesus transfigured on the Mount of Transfiguration. And also before Jesus was arrested to be taken up, to be crucified, Jesus spent some time in the Garden of Gethsemane, and these three people were with Jesus, whereas the remaining apostles and possibly a few other disciples were a bit far off. So these three people had very close encounter on three specific special occasions. And apart from that, what we also see are the others. Essentially, about 120 disciples were gathered in a room soon after Jesus had been crucified. What we also see, so soon after Jesus had ascended up into heaven. In other words, they were pretty early in the life of the church. And what we also see is that during Simon Peter's preaching, about 3,000 new disciples and a subsequent many thousand new disciples came into Jesus in a span of a few days or a few weeks. In other words, what we're talking about is, when we talk about the testimonies of the early church, we are really talking about these special categories that we need to have in our minds. Now, with that, we have come to the thoroughly exciting final stages of our analysis, and the final stages correspond to examining the specific witness statements of the persecuted, convicted, reliable witness early church. Now, in doing so, what I am also going to do is I am going to distinguish from the witness statements that they have. I am going to take out two categories of communication, specific points that they had. One category is what I am going to call as simple observations, and another category is what I call complex observations. Now, the reason why I like to distinguish the observations into simple and complex is for the below reason, and that is, we have earlier established and reiterated a couple of times that the disciples, the early disciples of Jesus, and they should be taken at the face value of their witness accounts, should be considered as reliable. Now, the only challenge then is, well, does that mean we would trust them in all that they are saying and therefore take their beliefs as our beliefs? That's not what I'm recommending. What I'm rather recommending is that we then separate out their witness account into simple observations and complex observations. Simple observations are things which are simple for them to evaluate and make a conclusion on. These simple observations, we can understand that even the conclusions they had could be taken as reliable conclusion purely because they had it, and we'll get into some details of such observations. The moment you see maybe the first couple of examples, you would see what I mean when I say simple observations. There are only a few observations, namely, did Jesus truly rise up back to life? Number one. Number two, could Jesus be considered as God? And only such observations are complex in nature, and therefore they are not purely dependent on the disciples watching event A and event B and therefore concluding something from it pretty easily. Only those complex observations we need to scrutinize their evaluation in, and then make our own judgment call about how we take those things. Now, with that thing, can I please introduce the simple observations to you, and hopefully it should be clear as we go on. For instance, the extravagant claims of Jesus Christ. The fact that Jesus claimed certain things, for example, him saying, I am the one greater than the temple. Now, that's a very simple observation. All that the disciples should have to do is just listen, and if Jesus said that statement, their testimonies, their witnesses for the fact that Jesus said those statements, said that specific statement. Similarly, Jesus saying that he was the Lord of the Sabbath. The only capability that the disciples should have had is the capability of hearing. If they could hear, then they could be considered reliable testimonies when they say Jesus in fact claimed that he was the Lord of the Sabbath. And when Jesus said, I am one with the Jewish God, for the fact that Jesus said that statement, these witnesses could be considered reliable, because Jesus making that statement and the witnesses hearing that is what we would call a simple observation. There is no complexity involved in this. Just being able to hear what Jesus was saying. So that should hopefully clarify what we call as simple observation. Now, with that, let's quickly move on through the remaining simple observations. The first one, of course, is the extravagant claims of Jesus Christ, which the church clearly communicates through the Gospels and through the book of Acts. Secondly, supernatural power witnessed in public, like human infirmities were healed, dead people were raised up back to life. Jesus demonstrated power over material things. Jesus demonstrated power over sin and also over spiritual beings, which we would call demons. Now this is a bit interesting, because why do we still call these things simple observations? Again, for instance, if we consider a dead man coming back to life, the reason I'm categorizing the references provided there for a dead man coming back to life as simple observation is because the early witnesses saw in this specific case people who were dead come back to life in one continual, let's say, sequence of observation. They didn't go anywhere else. They observed that someone was dead, and they saw that Jesus said something or did something, and then the dead man came back to life. Now, to conclude that as a rational thing, what we need to know is that if the disciples had the capability to see if someone was dead, if they could somehow verify it, and if they could somehow verify that the dead man was alive after that, because they hadn't gone anywhere else, there is no room for mischief in these encounters. And that's why we categorize these things. Even though they may look a bit complex, we still categorize these as simple observations. You may look at the various references provided, and you would see that in every single case the witnesses observe these things in one continual manner. So one thing you would also see is that within brackets, of course, I've stated that this witness, the category of witnessing is public, which means not only thorough eyewitnesses or inner circle of apostles saw these things, but also many other, what we would call general public, also saw the specific incidents referred to in this section. But apart from the display of the supernatural power in public, Jesus also demonstrated supernatural power to his thorough witnesses alone, and in some cases, at least in one specific case, to 3 specific apostles alone. Now for the latter, I gave you an example already when I defined what I meant by inner circle, and that was the case of a dead girl coming back to life. Apart from this, other simple observations. Voice from heaven. The early disciples heard voice from heaven like thunder speak to Jesus and the rest of the people who were around them. Now this, in one specific incident, happened in public, and in another incident happened when Jesus was with Simon Peter and James and John, what we would call the inner circle. And in that specific case, the boys also made a specific statement which said that Jesus was the beloved son of the one who was speaking, and that they were supposed to listen to him. Now again, these two we call as simple observation, because for the witnesses to be reliable witnesses in these cases, all that they should have had is the capability to hear, because we have established that we would take them at the face value when it comes to simple conclusions. If they heard such a voice, there is no reason for us to think they were lying or cheating, because they were willing even to die for their communication. And these things also do not leave any room for complex negotiation, and therefore these are again considered to be simple observation. Similarly, another simple observation is the transfiguration of Jesus. Jesus at one specific point in time transfigured to an extent, his face shone like the sun and his clothes as white as the light. Now these are examples of simple observations which are crucial for us to understand in evaluating some of the complex conclusions that we would look at later on. Now I am going to highlight three specific simple observations which we haven't seen so far, and say these three are very, very essential in our evaluation of whether Jesus is God, and we're going to do that in a couple of stages. And these three specific simple observations are the death, burial, and the sealing of the tomb of Jesus Christ. And you would see that when you go through the details of the witness accounts, that Jesus was adjudged to be dead by experts, and some of the details that we have are considered to be even reliable modern medical details. And what we'd also find is that he was buried in a place which was known to others, including some women disciples who even went and saw the place, apart from the couple of people who were involved in the burial. And the tomb was finally sealed by a Roman guard. And that's a simple observation. For the fact that Jesus died, we could take the disciples' witness statements at the face value, because as long as they could see that the Romans are killing or crucifying Jesus, and the Romans are judging Jesus to be dead, and people are taking Jesus' dead body and taking it to be buried and so on. These are simple observations. There is no place for mischief in this. So simple observation. The next simple observation is empty tomb. A few women disciples, and also later on Peter and the writer of the Gospel of John, saw an empty tomb. Now I don't even have to mention that, because the accounts of Jesus became so popular, now there must have been certainly all sorts of other people, including all the rest of Jesus' disciples and the Jewish leaders and maybe even the Roman administrators, would have witnessed the empty tomb. Again, it's a simple observation. All that you need to know is to go and see if the tomb is empty. And similarly, the next one, post-burial appearances of Jesus Christ. Mary Magdalene, a few other women, Cleopas and Simon, two specific disciples, many other disciples including all the apostles apart from Judas Iscariot, saw Jesus a few different times. Now these three are three distinct simple observations. What is complex in dealing with these three simple observations is how do we make some sense as to what could have happened based on these three simple observations. Just to reiterate, the simple observations that we are going to use in our analysis right now are the death of Jesus, the burial of Jesus, and the fact of him being placed in a tomb and secured by a Roman guard. That's a simple observation. The fact that later on in time the tomb was found empty by multiple witnesses. And finally, the fact that people saw Jesus appear to them after he was believed to have been dead and buried, and after they had noticed an empty tomb. How do we connect these three? And that's precisely where we'd be able to answer the crucial questions that we have been attempting to answer in the 4-session webinar series. If I may trace back from the final conclusion, which is Jesus God? The most crucial thing we'd like to know. But before that, we need to establish, did he rise up back to life? Did the resurrection really happen? And before that, maybe slightly less important is the fact that the specific identity of Jesus Christ. Now, looking at the perhaps in the interest of time, looking at the two things which are more crucial for us. Number one, did the resurrection happen? And number two, can we conclude that Jesus could be considered as God based on the resurrection and based on other simple observations that people had? Now, in order to consider the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we really need to go back to the final three simple observations that we looked at earlier, namely Jesus' death, burial, and sealing in a tomb, the empty tomb, and also post-burial appearances. Now, in order to, of course, one way of explaining the fact that a dead man who was buried was not found to be in his tomb, but also showed up to multiple people, let's say the straightforward explanation could be, of course, resurrection. But just to examine if there is any foul play in this, let us examine some alternative theories. Now, for any alternative theory to survive, what you would see is that the theory has to essentially undermine one or more of those three specific simple observations. For example, there is a theory called swoon theory, which essentially claims that perhaps Jesus wasn't dead, and therefore when he was put in the tomb, he wasn't even dead, and therefore he showed up alive later on. There is also another theory which we could consider, which is that perhaps people were lying about his death deliberately. Now, these two we need to consider. Here is where we need to consider all the historical evidences that we gathered in our session 3 and the session and our current session. In putting those things in detail and in perspective, what we saw was Jesus' death was collectively established to be true by the Roman executioners, the Roman administrators, the Jewish leaders, and also the disciples, all of them together. Why do I say that? The entire Roman apparatus was put in charge to execute Jesus. Roman authorities were there to execute Jesus, and Romans in the first century were the experts in execution, and arguably they are experts comparable to even 21st century experts in execution. And therefore, when someone says Jesus perhaps wasn't dead, they are undermining a crucial element of history, which is that Romans were experts in execution, and in this case Romans intended to execute Jesus. Also, to evaluate the administrative, let's say, capability of the Romans. For example, Pontius Pilate sent someone to check if Jesus was in fact dead when some people wanted to collect Jesus' body. In other words, it wasn't just the Roman soldiers involved in the execution or in the death and burial of Jesus, but also administrators, higher officials. Now Roman administration was one of the very well organized administrations, comparable to even some of the modern day administration, barring some advance in technology. Now, do we undermine them? I would think not. Now, third thing, Jewish leadership. We also saw in session 3, the Jewish leadership were offended at Jesus and they wanted to execute Jesus. Now, they followed that case up quite deliberately, quite consistently. When we say that Jesus perhaps wasn't dead, he was perhaps alive, we are essentially undermining the, let's say, the vigor with which the Jewish leadership followed upon this case of Jesus Christ. So, in other words, when we look at various evidences, finally also to remind the motivation of the Christians, if we said that the Christians did not see Jesus die, that then essentially what we are saying is, why would they ever think that they could face persecution if Jesus wasn't dead and later on came back to life? Why would they be willing to face persecution? Is again something we would need to consider. In other words, put together the implicit points and the explicit points that we gather from the Roman soldiers, from the Roman administrators, from the Jewish leadership, and from the early church. What we need to necessarily conclude was that Jesus was dead and he was put in a tomb. Secondly, the empty tomb. Again, apart from resurrection, what are the other ways in which we could explain an empty tomb? Here is where there are a couple of possibilities which people have tried over the years. One is that the disciples came and stole Jesus' body away, and another was that the disciples were purely lying about the empty tomb. Now, both of them have some fundamental problems. The problems include the fact that if the tomb wasn't empty, why didn't the Jewish leadership or why didn't the Roman leadership come and say, hey, you know what, here is the tomb, it is not empty. Why would they let early Christians, who both the Jews and the Roman administrators did not like, to go ahead and spread the story that they had, which was that the tomb was empty? So again, logic helps us understand that the tomb must have been really empty. Now, thirdly, the post-burial appearances of Jesus Christ. Now, of course, earlier we saw that at multiple points in time, various different people saw Jesus alive. Now, a couple of ways of explaining this alternative to resurrection theory are things like what is called hallucination theory, which is that Jesus wasn't really alive, but these people hallucinated that they were seeing him. Now, the problem with that is of course the fact that how could different people at different contexts hallucinate about the same thing? And problem number 2 is, if they were in fact hallucinating, then of course the story that they were spreading, which is that Jesus was risen, could have been easily quelled by the Roman administrators and the Jewish leadership by merely pointing to the tomb where Jesus' body was placed. In other words, hallucination isn't really logically viable theory to explain post-burial appearances of Jesus Christ. Another theory is that perhaps people deliberately lied, or the early Christians deliberately lied about seeing, not that they hallucinated, but they deliberately lied. Again, these have similar problems. If they had lied, why couldn't the Jewish leadership, or why couldn't the Roman leadership essentially show the dead body of Jesus in the tomb and say, hey, your Jesus is here, do not go around spreading lies? In other words, the point is there is no way to undermine these 3 simple observations that the early disciples had, and these were simple enough. Of course, combining together, we need to come up with a complex rationale or complex underlying reason or underlying theory to explain these three simple theories together. But apart from that, the specific 3 points in isolation are simple enough. Did they see an empty tomb? Did they see post-burial appearances of Jesus? Did they see Jesus, the place where Jesus was buried? Now the point is, we have gone through a few alternatives there, and we have established that none of them stand to clear scrutiny. There's only one logical explanation for bringing these three simple observations together, and that is that the dead Jesus who was buried really vacated the tomb and he showed up alive, and that convinced the early witnesses. But the Jewish leadership had no way of rebutting the claims of the early Christian witnesses, and so was the case with even the Roman authorities. In other words, together the Roman authorities, the Jewish leadership, and the early Christians, especially given the fact that the early Christians faced up to persecution and did not take back some of the communication that they had, it is clear that Jesus must have truly risen back to life. Now the only subsequent question is, does that mean he was God? And here is where we're going to put together a few other simple observations that we had. Things like a voice coming from heaven, both in public and also especially to a few inner circle disciples, essentially saying that Jesus was supernatural, and Jesus himself clarifying that he was one with the Jewish God and that he was the one greater than the temple of God, meaning that he was God himself, and that he was the Lord of the Sabbath, meaning the God of the Jewish people as revealed in the Hebrew scriptures. In other words, the point is, based on simple observations, we established that Jesus in fact was risen back to life after he was dead, and based on that, the validity of that claim, and based on some other simple observations, especially that of Jesus' own claims about himself, we should be able to essentially say, hey, this supernatural person who was able to come back to life must be believed at the face value of his communication, which was really that he was God. And that's precisely the objective with which we started off. And I'm glad that we could come to that conclusion after the 4-session series. Now I'd like to open the floor up for any question that we may have, yeah, let us try and see if there is any question. Like I said earlier, there are a few ways of asking questions. One is that you do a live chat on the YouTube channel, and the other is that you can text the question on the mobile phone on the screen. If I can have a look at the live chat, please, Ruby. If you please say got it. If you please click on got it, please. Thank you. I'm waiting to see if there is any question about the identity of Jesus, about resurrection, and in regards to identity, the specific point about the fact that Jesus could be considered as God, because that was precisely his claim about himself. I can't see any questions coming in, but I do see a few people watching this video at this time. I do thank you for watching. Now I'd like to conclude by essentially mentioning something about Jesus. Now Jesus who I have testified through the 4-part series that we had finishing just now. That same Jesus I have experienced personally in my life. I'm 33 years old now, and in my life so far, I have heard God speak, and I have also seen dreams and visions and different other interactions with God, with the God who confirmed that He was the God of the Bible, especially Jesus Christ Himself. And therefore, apart from all the objective analysis that we have had so far, I'd also like to personally commend Him to yourself. The good God that I am personally aware of is willing to reach out to every single human being on the face of the earth. God created human beings in His own image to begin with. We have, unfortunately, because of all sorts of reasons in human history, have strayed away from Him. But thankfully, the God who created us is a good God, wonderful God, and He wants to re-establish the relationship that He originally intended to have with human beings. And therefore, Jesus Christ came into this world to pay for all the disobediences and all sorts of other reasons which took you away from Him. He paid that all on the cross, and He wants to essentially take us back to Him. Us having a reinstated relationship with God is not cheap. It came at a really high price, and the price was that God Himself had to take up human form and had to lay down His own life for our sake. So it is not cheap, but the good news is that it is free. Even though it is not cheap, and as a matter of fact highly invaluable, because God shed His own blood for us, it is completely free for us. And all that it takes on our behalf is to say, God, please, I'd like to be with You. Please help me out. Jesus, I'd like to be with You. Please help me out. Please help me in the rest of my life. Let me know how I should be walking. Because Jesus said, deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow me. Deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow me. That Jesus Christ, who received me many, many years ago, who spoke to me at multiple points in time, and revealed things about Himself to me in stages, is willing to lead you also into eternal life with Him. May God richly bless you. Thank you very much for watching this 4-part series. And God willing, we may have further similar series coming up. God willing, sometime in the long term, we are thinking about this even being a 10-part series dealing with some other portions that we haven't touched upon in our current series. Even things like, can we consider the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, to be reliable? What kind of evidence is available for us to consider so, and so on? So we are thinking about various topics like that in the long run. But hopefully, God willing, even beginning next Tuesday, there should be a fresh installation, fresh installment of the series. Thank you very much for watching, and may God richly bless you.